July 22, 1991, 12:15 a.m. Andrew Lee Jones walks his final steps down the corridor at Angola prison. His hands shake, not from fear of death, but from what's waiting in the room ahead. The electric chair. Gruesome Gertie, inmates called it, and they had good reason. Because when Louisiana's death row prisoners learned the state was switching to lethal injection in just 8 weeks, they all shared one desperate hope: survive until September 15th. Miss that deadline and you'd face the chair. Jones missed it by 55 days. The guards strap him down. Leather bindings across his chest, arms, legs. A metal cap with a wet sponge, soaked in saline to conduct 2,000 volts through his skull. A hood over his face so witnesses won't see his eyes. Outside the death chamber, the prison chaplain later reported what he heard through the walls: the hum of the generator, the sharp crack of electricity, the smell that no one who witnessed an electrocution ever forgot. Jones was 36 years old. He would be the last person in Louisiana to die this way. But the story of Gruesome Gertie didn't start or end with him. This is the story of America's most feared execution method. How it worked. Why death row inmates would rather die any other way. And why Louisiana's governor refused to delay Jones's execution by 2 months, even when his own parole board begged him to wait. Because when you understand what happened in that room at Angola, you understand why the electric chair became too brutal even for a prison system designed to punish.
If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content.
Angola prison didn't just house Louisiana's electric chair. It owned the most notorious one in America. Gruesome Gertie earned her name through repetition, through malfunction, through the kind of executions that left witnesses vomiting in the parking lot and guards requesting transfers. The chair arrived at Angola in 1941, replacing the portable electric chair that had traveled from parish to parish like a carnival attraction. Louisiana wanted something permanent, something that would make death row inmates understand the finality of their sentence. They got more than they bargained for. The first problem was the chair itself. Built in the 1940s with technology that was already questionable, Gruesome Gertie ran on a generator that frequently failed. Former Angola warden Ross Maggio later described the equipment as temperamental at best, barbaric at worst. But it wasn't the age of the machine that terrified inmates. It was what happened when things went wrong. Willie Francis knew that terror better than anyone. May 3, 1946. Francis, 17 years old, convicted of murder, became Gruesome Gertie's most infamous survivor. When the executioner threw the switch, the chair malfunctioned. Francis received a shock, enough to cause excruciating pain, but not enough to kill him. Witnesses reported him screaming, "Take it off! Let me breathe!" The guards did. They had no choice. The generator had failed completely. Francis was returned to his cell. His lawyers immediately filed appeals arguing that executing him again would constitute cruel and unusual punishment. Double jeopardy. Torture. The Supreme Court disagreed. 5-4 decision. 1 year later, on May 9, 1947, Willie Francis sat in Gruesome Gertie a second time. This time the machine worked. That case haunted Angola for decades. It wasn't the only malfunction, just the most famous. Death row inmates traded stories about the chair like ghost tales, except these were documented in official reports. There was the execution where the sponge wasn't properly soaked, causing the condemned man's head to catch fire. The one where the current was too low, requiring multiple cycles while the prisoner remained conscious. The execution where the leather straps broke mid-cycle. According to former death row counselor Sister Helen Prejean, who spent decades ministering to condemned inmates at Angola, the electric chair represented their deepest nightmare. Not death but the method. They would tell me, "I'm not afraid to die, sister. I'm afraid of how I'll die," Prejean later recounted in interviews. The chair meant uncertainty. Would it work? Would they suffer? How long would it take? Medical examiners who performed autopsies on electrocuted prisoners documented the physical effects. Ruptured blood vessels in the eyes, severe burns at contact points, internal organ damage from the extreme heat. The electrical current literally cooked the body from inside. By the 1970s, death penalty opponents were using medical evidence to challenge electrocution as unconstitutional. They had plenty of material to work with. But Angola kept using Gertie. Between 1941 and 1991, Louisiana executed 87 people in the electric chair. Not all at Angola, some at the women's prison in St. Gabriel, but Gruesome Gertie handled the majority. The ritual was always the same. The condemned prisoner would be moved from death row to a holding cell near the execution chamber 24 hours before the scheduled time. They could request a final meal within budget constraints. They could receive visitors through reinforced glass. At midnight, Louisiana always executed at midnight, the walk would begin. Corrections officers would shave the prisoner's head and right calf. The bare skin was necessary for proper electrode contact. Then they'd lead the condemned down the corridor, past the other death row cells where inmates could hear every footstep. Former death row inmate Wilbert Rideau, who spent 44 years at Angola before his conviction was overturned, later described those nights. You could hear everything. The footsteps. The door to the chamber opening. Then silence. Then the hum when they threw the switch. Everyone on the row knew exactly what was happening. Inside the death chamber, the prisoner would be strapped into the chair. Arms, legs, chest, head. The metal cap with the soaked sponge would be fitted onto their shaved skull. A leather mask would cover their face, officially to spare the witnesses from seeing the condemned person's final expressions, but also to hide what the electricity did to facial features. The executioner sat in an adjacent room, separated by a wall. When the warden gave the signal, the executioner would throw the switch. 2000 volts for 30 seconds. Then the current would be reduced to 500 volts. Then back up to 2000 volts for another cycle. If the heart was still beating, they'd repeat the process. The prison physician would check for vital signs. If none existed, the execution was complete. If the heart still beat, another cycle. This wasn't theoretical. It happened. By 1988, the legal challenges to electrocution had mounted. Florida's electric chair malfunctioned during the execution of Jesse Taffero, causing his head to burst into flames. Virginia, Georgia, and other states were quietly switching to lethal injection. Louisiana's legislature finally acted. In 1991, they passed Act 854, mandating that all executions after September 15, 1991, would be conducted by lethal injection. But the law didn't provide retroactive protection. Anyone sentenced to death before the law took effect could still face the chair. Andrew Lee Jones's execution date was July 22, 1991. 55 days too early. Andrew Lee Jones never thought he'd end up on death row. Born in 1955 in rural Louisiana, Jones had a criminal record, burglary, theft, assault, but nothing that suggested he'd become a killer. Former acquaintances later described him as someone who made bad decisions when desperate, not someone predisposed to violence. That changed on June 8, 1984. Temekika Jackson was 11 years old. She was the daughter of Jones's ex-girlfriend, a woman he'd been in a relationship with before they separated. According to trial testimony, Jones had harbored resentment over the breakup and had made threats. On that June evening, Jones abducted Temekika from her home. What followed was documented in forensic evidence and witness statements that prosecutors presented at trial: kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder. The child's body was found days later. The crime devastated the community. The trial was swift. Jones was convicted in 1985 and sentenced to death. He was 30 years old. The jury deliberated less than an hour on the sentence. He joined death row at Angola, where he would spend the next 6 years waiting. Death row at Angola wasn't a single unit, it was a world unto itself. Tier by tier, cell by cell, men lived in 6 by 9 foot concrete boxes, 23 hours a day. 1 hour for recreation in a concrete yard. Meals delivered through slots. Showers 3 times a week. The psychological toll was documented by researchers who studied long-term death row confinement. Former Angola warden Burl Kane later acknowledged in interviews that death row isolation caused severe mental deterioration in many inmates. Depression, anxiety, psychosis. But what separated Angola's death row from others wasn't just the isolation. It was the proximity to Gruesome Gertie. The death chamber sat at the end of the same building. Inmates could hear preparations for executions. They could hear the generator test. They knew the schedule because guards couldn't hide the increased activity when an execution date approached. Jones spent 6 years listening to that machinery, knowing his turn was coming. Then, in early 1991, news spread through death row that changed everything. The Louisiana legislature was debating Act 854, the bill that would eliminate the electric chair and mandate lethal injection for all future executions. Inmates followed the legislative process through their attorneys, through news reports, through any information they could gather. The bill passed in June 1991. Governor Buddy Roemer signed it into law on July 9, 1991. Effective date: September 15, 1991. 4 death row inmates with execution dates after mid-September. This was salvation. They would still die, but by injection, a method considered far less terrifying, far less prone to malfunction, far more humane than electrocution. 4 Andrew Lee Jones, whose execution was scheduled for July 22, 1991, it was a death sentence of the cruelest kind. His attorneys immediately filed appeals arguing that the execution should be delayed until after the law took effect. They presented medical evidence about electrocution's brutality. They cited the Willie Francis case, proof that Louisiana's electric chair could and did malfunction. The Louisiana Board of Pardons reviewed the case. In an extraordinary move, the 5-member board voted unanimously to recommend clemency. Not a pardon, but a 120-day reprieve. Just long enough for the lethal injection law to take effect. Board member Howard Marcellus later told reporters, "We felt it was appropriate to delay the execution given that the legislature had already determined electrocution was not the preferred method." The recommendation went to Governor Buddy Roemer. Roemer, a reform-minded Republican who had championed education and environmental causes during his term, had never granted clemency in a death penalty case. He had built a reputation as tough on crime, and 1991 was an election year. He was facing former Ku Klux Klan leader David Duke and former Governor Edwin Edwards in the upcoming gubernatorial race, a political environment where appearing soft on crime could be fatal to a campaign. Jones's attorneys met with Roemer's staff. They presented the parole board's recommendation. They argued that delaying the execution by 2 months wouldn't undermine justice. It would simply align with the legislature's own determination that lethal injection was more appropriate. On July 18, 1991, 4 days before the scheduled execution, Roemer announced his decision. No clemency. In his statement, Roemer said, "This man deserves what he is about to get. The crime was heinous." The jury spoke. Justice will be served. Legal experts later noted the unusual nature of the situation. In most cases where execution methods changed, courts or governors provided transition periods. When states switched from hanging to electrocution, or from gas chambers to lethal injection, condemned prisoners typically received the benefit of the newer, supposedly more humane method. Not Jones. His final appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court was denied on July 21, 1991, 13 hours before his execution. That evening, Jones met with his family for the last time. His mother, his siblings, his own children from a previous relationship. They spoke through reinforced glass in the death row visiting area. Former Angola chaplain Reverend James Richardson, who ministered to Jones in his final hours, later described the condemned man as resigned but terrified. Not of death but of the chair. "He asked me if it would hurt," Richardson recounted in an interview years later. "I couldn't lie to him. I said I didn't know. But I prayed with him. I told him God would be with him." Jones requested his final meal: fried chicken, potato salad, biscuits, and pecan pie. He ate little of it. At 11 p.m. on July 22, 1991, corrections officers came to his cell. It was time to prepare. The barber arrived with electric clippers. Jones's head was shaved clean. Then his right calf, bare skin for the leg electrode. At 11:45 p.m. the walk began. Jones, flanked by 4 guards, walked the 53 steps from his death row cell to the execution chamber. Gruesome Gertie was waiting. In 55 days the chair would be retired forever. But tonight it had one more job to do. The execution chamber at Angola measured exactly 12 feet by 15 feet. Small enough that witnesses could see everything. Large enough to hold the chair, the witnesses, the officials, and the machinery of death. Gruesome Gertie sat in the center, bolted to the concrete floor. When Andrew Lee Jones entered at 11:47 p.m., escorted by 4 corrections officers, he saw what every condemned prisoner before him had seen. The chair waiting under harsh fluorescent lights, leather straps hanging loose, the metal electrode cap suspended above the headrest like a waiting crown. Behind the observation window, 17 witnesses had gathered. The victim's family, Temekika Jackson's mother and relatives. Media representatives from 3 newspapers and 2 television stations. The prison warden. A representative from the Louisiana Attorney General's office. And Sister Helen Prejean, the anti-death penalty activist who had counseled Jones in his final weeks and would later write about this night in her book, Dead Man Walking. The witnesses sat in metal folding chairs, separated from the execution chamber by reinforced glass. They could see everything. They would hear nothing. The chamber was soundproofed. Jones looked at the chair. His legs buckled slightly. The guard steadied him. Warden Hilton Butler stood near the chamber door, clipboard in hand. The protocol required him to ask one final question. "Do you have any last words?" Jones nodded. His voice, witnesses later reported, was barely audible. "I'm sorry for what I done. I'm sorry to the family. I ask God to forgive me and I hope y'all can forgive me too." He paused, looking directly at Temekika's mother through the window. "I know you can't, but I had to say it." Then he looked at Sister Prejean. "Pray for me, sister." The guards guided him to the chair. The strapping process took 4 minutes. Thick leather restraints across his chest. Arms strapped to the armrests, wrists bound. Legs secured to the chair legs. A strap across his forehead to prevent head movement. One guard knelt to attach the leg electrode, a metal cuff with a dampened sponge, wrapped around Jones's shaved right calf. The electrode was connected by cable to the generator in the adjacent room. Another guard positioned the skull cap. The metal dome, lined with a natural sea sponge soaked in saline solution, was placed carefully on Jones's shaved head. The chin strap was buckled tight. The electrical contact had to be perfect. Too loose and the current wouldn't conduct properly. Too tight, and it could cause burns before the execution even began. Finally, the leather hood. A guard pulled the black mask over Jones's face, covering his eyes, nose, mouth. The official reason was to spare witnesses from seeing the condemned person's final expressions. The practical reason was to hide what 2000 volts did to facial features. Jones's breathing, visible in the rise and fall of his chest, became rapid. Warden Butler checked his watch. 11:53 p.m. He looked toward the executioner's room, a separate chamber adjacent to the death room where the executioner sat out of sight. Louisiana law protected the executioner's identity. No one in the witness gallery knew who operated the switch. Butler raised his hand. In the witness gallery, Temekika Jackson's mother gripped the hand of her sister. One reporter later described her expression as beyond grief, something harder, colder. Sister Prejean closed her eyes, her lips moving in silent prayer. Butler dropped his hand. The executioner threw the switch. What happened next lasted exactly 2 minutes and 9 seconds, according to official records. The first cycle delivered 2000 volts for 20 seconds. Jones's body went rigid against the restraints. His hands clenched into fists so tight that his knuckles went white. His spine arched despite the chest strap. Witnesses reported seeing smoke rise from the leg electrode. The smell, witnesses consistently described it as burning flesh mixed with electrical ozone, began to permeate the observation area despite the sealed glass. The current dropped to 500 volts for 10 seconds, then surged back to 2000 volts for another 20-second cycle. The prison physician, Dr. George McCormick, stood ready with a stethoscope. When the current stopped, he stepped forward, lifted the hood partially and checked for vital signs. Jones's heart was still beating. Protocol required a second cycle. Dr. McCormick stepped back. Butler signaled again. Another surge. Another 20 seconds at 2000 volts. This time, when the current stopped and the doctor checked, there was no heartbeat. Time of death, 12:15 a.m., July 23, 1991. The witnesses were escorted out immediately. Prison policy prevented them from seeing the body removed from the chair. Several witnesses were visibly shaken. One reporter vomited in the hallway outside the observation area. Temekika Jackson's mother made no statement to the waiting media outside the prison. She simply got into a waiting car and left. Sister Prejean later described what she witnessed. It was brutal. Clinical and brutal. They killed him, yes, but the method, the machinery, the smoke, the smell, it was designed to be terrifying. Not just for him but for everyone watching. After the witnesses left, corrections officers began the process of removing Jones's body from the chair. The leather straps had to be cut. The electrical current had caused his muscles to contract so violently that the buckles couldn't be released normally. The autopsy, conducted later that morning, documented severe electrical burns at both electrode contact points, ruptured blood vessels throughout the body, and internal organ damage consistent with extreme heat trauma. Dr. McCormick, who had witnessed multiple executions by electrocution during his tenure at Angola, later told researchers, "Lethal injection is clinically cleaner. With the chair there were always variables. Equipment failure. Human error. Even when everything worked as designed, it was violent." Gruesome Gertie had completed her final execution. 55 days later, on September 15, 1991, Louisiana's lethal injection law took effect. The electric chair was disconnected from its power source and moved to storage. But the story of Andrew Lee Jones, and what happened in that chamber, would haunt Angola for decades to come. Because everyone involved knew the same truth. If the execution had been delayed by 8 weeks, Jones would have died differently. Not peacefully. Not painlessly. But differently. Gruesome Gertie sat in storage for 7 years. After September 15, 1991, Angola's execution chamber underwent renovation. The electrical infrastructure was removed. New equipment arrived. A gurney for Stan's medical monitoring devices. Louisiana had joined the majority of death penalty states in adopting lethal injection. The transition seemed complete. But Gruesome Gertie's story wasn't over. In 1998, the Louisiana legislature revisited the execution statute. Some lawmakers argued that condemned prisoners should have a choice: electrocution or lethal injection. The debate centered on autonomy. Shouldn't inmates have the right to choose their method of death? Death penalty opponents saw something darker in the proposal. Former Angola prisoner advocate Clive Stafford Smith later described it as offering people the choice between being killed badly and being killed slightly less badly. The bill failed. Gertie remained in storage. But across the United States, electric chairs weren't disappearing, they were becoming backup options. In 1999, Florida's electric chair malfunctioned during the execution of Alan Lee Davis. Witnesses reported blood flowing from beneath his face mask. The malfunction reignited national debate about electrocution's constitutionality. Virginia executed Earl Bramblett by electrocution in 2003, at his own request. He chose the chair over lethal injection, believing it would be faster. Nebraska didn't eliminate its electric chair until 2008, when the state Supreme Court ruled electrocution unconstitutional as cruel and unusual punishment. As of 2024, 8 states still allow electrocution as an execution method, though most only as an alternative if lethal injection is unavailable or if the condemned prisoner chooses it. Louisiana isn't one of them. After 1991, the state never executed another person by electric chair. But the legacy of Gruesome Gertie, and executions like Andrew Lee Jones's, shaped how Louisiana approached capital punishment going forward. The Louisiana Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, founded in 1990, used Jones's execution as a rallying point. Sister Helen Prejean, who witnessed Jones die, became one of America's most prominent anti-death penalty advocates. Her book, Dead Man Walking, published in 1993, detailed her experiences ministering to condemned inmates at Angola. The book became a bestseller. A Hollywood film followed in 1995, starring Susan Sarandon and Sean Penn, bringing Angola's death row to national attention. The executions didn't stop. Louisiana continued using lethal injection, but public opinion began shifting. Former Angola warden Burl Cain, who oversaw the prison from 1995 to 2016, implemented dramatic reforms on death row. He introduced educational programs, religious services, and allowed death row inmates more time outside their cells. In interviews, Cain acknowledged the psychological damage of death row isolation. You can't keep a man in a cage 23 hours a day for years and expect him to maintain his humanity. Even if he's condemned to die, he's still human until that moment comes. The reforms didn't change death sentences, but they changed conditions. Death row at Angola slowly transformed from the purely punitive environment of the Gruesome Gertie era into something resembling, though never achieving, basic human dignity. Meanwhile, the physical remnants of Louisiana's electric chair era disappeared. In 2000, Angola Prison Museum opened to the public. Located just outside the main prison grounds, the museum displayed artifacts of Louisiana's penal history. Vintage prison uniforms, confiscated weapons, photographs documenting the prison's evolution. Gruesome Gertie became an exhibit. The chair sat behind protective barriers, accompanied by informational placards explaining its history. Visitors could see the leather straps, the metal electrode cap, the worn wood where 87 people had died between 1941 and 1991. Tour guides at the museum recounted execution stories, including Andrew Lee Jones's final moments. The narrative was carefully crafted, acknowledging the brutality while emphasizing the crimes that led condemned prisoners to the chair. Some visitors found the exhibit educational. Others found it disturbing, a relic of state-sanctioned violence displayed like a historical curiosity. Former death row inmate Wilbert Rideau, whose murder conviction was overturned in 2005 after 44 years of imprisonment, visited the museum after his release. He stood before Gruesome Gertie, the chair he'd lived in fear of for decades. In later interviews, Rideau described the experience, seeing it there, disconnected, powerless. It looked smaller than I remembered, but I could still smell that corridor. Still hear the generator. still feel what we all felt every time someone walked that walk. The museum exhibit prompted uncomfortable questions. Was displaying an execution device educational or exploitative? Did it honor victims of crime or celebrate state violence? Should instruments of death be preserved as historical artifacts? Angola Museum director disagrees with critics. The museum's mission, he argued, was to document reality, both the crimes that brought people to Angola and the punishments the state imposed. Yet Gruesome Gertie's presence in the museum created an undeniable truth. Louisiana's electric chair had become a tourist attraction. Thousands of visitors annually paid admission to see the chair, to read about executions, to imagine what happened in that chamber. Some came out of morbid curiosity. Others came seeking to understand capital punishment's history. For victims' families, the museum offered a different kind of closure. Temekeka Jackson's relatives never publicly commented on the museum exhibit, but other victims' families have visited, finding some measure of peace in seeing the justice system's mechanisms on display. For abolitionists, Gertie's museum placement proved their point. Electrocution was so brutal that even Louisiana relegated it to historical artifact status, implicitly acknowledging its cruelty. As of 2024, Louisiana still has the death penalty. The state maintains a lethal injection chamber at Angola. Death row still houses condemned prisoners. But Gruesome Gertie sits silent behind museum glass. The chair that killed 87 people. The chair that terrified death row for 50 years. The chair that defined Angola's darkest chapter. Now it's a reminder of what the state decided was too brutal to continue. Even in a prison designed for punishment, some methods proved too harsh to justify. The electric chair was sold to America as humane. When New York State conducted the first electric chair execution in 1890, killing William Kemmler for murder, advocates claimed it would be instantaneous and painless. A vast improvement over hanging, which could take minutes of strangulation if the neck didn't break. They were wrong. Kemmler's execution took 8 minutes. The first electrical charge failed to kill him. Witnesses reported him gasping and convulsing while smoke rose from his body. The second charge caused his blood vessels to rupture and his flesh to burn. One witness, a reporter for the New York Times, called it an awful spectacle, far worse than hanging. Yet the electric chair spread across America. By 1949, 26 states used electrocution as their primary execution method. The reasoning was simple. Electricity was modern, scientific, associated with progress and technology. If electricity could power cities and factories, surely it could deliver quick, efficient death. But the science behind electrocution was never as clean as its advocates claimed. Dr. Atul Gawande, a surgeon and public health researcher, analyzed execution methods in a 2006 article for The New Yorker. His research on electrocution revealed disturbing physiological realities. When 2,000 volts course through a human body, the immediate effect is massive muscular contraction. Every muscle in the body contracts simultaneously with such force that it can fracture bones and rupture organs. The electrical current doesn't simply stop the heart. It causes the heart muscle to fibrillate chaotically. The lungs cease. Brain activity doesn't cease immediately. Electroencephalogram studies on animals subjected to similar electrical currents show brain activity continuing for up to 30 seconds after the shock begins. 30 seconds of consciousness while your body burns from the inside. The heat generated by electrical resistance is extreme. At contact points, the skull cap and leg electrode, temperatures can exceed 200 degrees Fahrenheit. The dampened sponges used to improve conductivity literally boil, creating the steam and smoke that witnesses consistently reported. Internal organs cook. Autopsies of electrocuted prisoners documented temperatures inside body cavities reaching 138 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cause severe thermal damage to the brain, heart, liver, and kidneys. Dr. Harold Hillman, a British physiologist who studied execution methods, described electrocution as one of the most brutal methods of execution, causing extreme suffering before death occurs. The medical evidence contradicted everything the electric chair's advocates had promised. Former medical examiners who performed autopsies on electrocuted prisoners documented consistent patterns of injury. Electrical burns penetrating deep into tissue at contact points, ruptured blood vessels throughout the body, evidence of extreme muscle trauma, and damage to internal organs from both electrical current and heat. Dr. George McCormick, the Angola physician who pronounced Andrew Lee Jones dead, later participated in research examining electrocution's effects. In interviews, he acknowledged that medical professionals involved in executions faced an ethical paradox. They were trained to preserve life, yet required to participate in, and certify, death. "We tell ourselves it's quick," McCormick said in a 1995 interview. But the medical evidence suggests otherwise. The body doesn't die instantly. There's a process, violent, damaging, and likely conscious for at least several seconds. The variables that made electrocution unpredictable were numerous. Electrical conductivity varies between individuals based on body composition. People with higher water content conduct electricity differently than those with more body fat. The dampness of the sponges matters. Too wet and the current disperses inefficiently. Too dry and severe burns occur before death. The age and maintenance of equipment played crucial roles. Angola's generator, installed in 1941, was 50 years old when it killed Andrew Lee Jones. Regular maintenance could prevent some malfunctions, but aging electrical systems were inherently unreliable. Human error factored heavily. The executioner's timing, how long to maintain each electrical cycle, required judgment, not scientific precision. Official protocols existed, but implementation varied. These variables explained why some electrocutions appeared to proceed smoothly while others became horror shows. Willie Francis's botched 1946 execution wasn't an anomaly, it was a predictable outcome of unreliable technology operated by fallible humans. The legal challenges to electrocution intensified through the 1980s and 1990s as medical evidence accumulated. Defense attorneys argued that electrocution violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. They presented expert medical testimony about consciousness during electrocution, about the extreme pain the condemned person likely experienced, about the burns and organ damage. Courts remained divided. Some ruled that evidence of suffering wasn't enough to declare a method unconstitutional unless it was deliberately cruel or showed wanton infliction of pain. But states began abandoning the electric chair anyway, not because courts forced them to, but because lethal injection seemed cleaner, more medical, less obviously violent. Lethal injection was sold as the humane alternative. A series of drugs. One to render the person unconscious, one to paralyze the muscles, one to stop the heart. It looked like a medical procedure. The condemned person lying on a gurney. 4 lines. Chemical cocktails. Clinical language, administration of protocol, instead of execution. Dr. Joel Zivit, an anesthesiologist who has studied lethal injection, later argued that this method merely concealed suffering rather than eliminating it. If the first drug fails to achieve full unconsciousness, the paralytic prevents the condemned person from showing distress while the final drug causes the sensation of suffocation and cardiac arrest. But lethal injection didn't produce smoke or burning flesh. It didn't cause visible convulsions. The paralytic prevented that. It looked peaceful to witnesses. That appearance mattered more than medical reality. By 2020, only 8 states retained electrocution as a legal execution method, and most required it only as a backup when lethal injection drugs were unavailable. The electric chair's fall from dominance wasn't driven primarily by courts or constitutional principle. It was driven by optics. Gruesome Gertie killed Andrew Lee Jones because the method was too visibly brutal to defend. If his execution had been delayed 55 days, he would have died on a gurney with chemicals coursing through his veins. Still dead. Possibly still suffering. But the suffering would have been invisible to the 17 witnesses who watched through reinforced glass. And in America's death penalty system, invisibility had become the new standard for humanity. On July 23, 1991, the morning after Andrew Lee Jones's execution, Angola prison returned to routine. Death row inmates ate breakfast in their cells. Work crews headed to the fields. Angola's 18,000-acre grounds still operated as a working farm. Guards changed shifts. The prison administration filed paperwork documenting the execution. But something fundamental had changed. Gruesome Gertie would never be used again. The question that haunted Angola and Louisiana's criminal justice system wasn't whether Jones deserved to die for murdering an 11-year-old child. The jury had decided that. The courts had upheld it. The question was whether the method mattered. Former Louisiana Attorney General Richard Ayoub, who served during the transition from electric chair to lethal injection, later reflected on this period. "We believed in capital punishment. But we also recognized that how we executed people said something about who we were as a society. The chair had become indefensible, not because execution was wrong, but because that particular method was too brutal to justify." The timing of Jones's execution, 55 days before the law changed, highlighted a cruel irony that death penalty opponents seized upon. If the legislature had determined electrocution was inappropriate for future executions, how could it be appropriate for Jones? If lethal injection was more humane, didn't Jones deserve that same consideration? Governor Buddy Roemer's decision to deny clemency came at a political cost. He lost the 1991 gubernatorial election to Edwin Edwards in a runoff widely remembered because the other candidate was David Duke, forcing voters to choose between a corrupt politician and a former Klan leader. Roemer's loss had multiple causes, but death penalty advocates noted that his handling of the Jones case satisfied no one. Victims' families wanted swift justice, while Jones's execution method disturbed moderates who questioned the arbitrary timing. The broader lesson wasn't about one execution. It was about how death penalty policy evolved through incremental changes rather than sweeping abolition. Louisiana didn't eliminate capital punishment after Gruesome Gertie. The state simply changed the method, making executions less visibly brutal. Between 1991 and 2024, Louisiana executed 7 more people, all by lethal injection. The numbers declined not because the death penalty was abolished, but because juries became more reluctant to impose death sentences, appeals took longer, and pharmaceutical companies began refusing to sell execution drugs. Angola's death row population actually grew during this period. As of 2024, Louisiana's death row housed over 60 condemned prisoners, most waiting years or decades for execution dates that might never come. The death penalty in Louisiana had become effectively frozen, legally intact but practically dormant. Sister Helen Prejean's advocacy, which began with ministering to condemned men at Angola, evolved into a national movement. Her organization, the Louisiana Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, pushed for legislative change, public education, and support for victims' families who opposed execution. In interviews, Prejean consistently returned to the same theme: killing people to show that killing people is wrong doesn't work. I witnessed Andrew Lee Jones die in that chair, and I can tell you it didn't bring Temeka Jackson back. It didn't heal her family. It just created more violence. Victims' families remained divided on this question. Some found closure in execution. They attended lethal injection procedures at Angola, bearing witness as the person who destroyed their lives was put to death. For them, justice required finality. Others found that execution provided no healing. Temeka Jackson's family never made public statements about whether Jones's death brought them peace. Their silence spoke volumes about the complexity of grief that no execution could resolve. The debate over capital punishment continued, but Gruesome Gertie's retirement marked a watershed. Even death penalty supporters acknowledged that some methods were too barbaric to defend. By 2020, only 2 states, Tennessee and South Carolina, still conducted electrocutions, and only when inmates requested it or lethal injection drugs were unavailable. The electric chair had gone from America's dominant execution method to a historical relic in less than a century. Angola Prison Museum's Gruesome Gertie exhibit became a pilgrimage site for both death penalty supporters and opponents, each group seeing in the chair evidence for their position. Supporters pointed to the crimes that brought 87 people to that chair. They emphasized victims' suffering, arguing that capital punishment, regardless of method, served justice. Opponents pointed to the chair itself, the burns, the malfunctions, the suffering it caused, arguing that if electrocution was too cruel to continue, perhaps all execution methods were equally indefensible, just better disguised. The truth lay somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. Societies could oppose brutal execution methods while still supporting capital punishment, creating an ever-shifting standard of what constituted humane death. Andrew Lee Jones's execution represented the end of one era and the beginning of another, not the end of capital punishment, but the end of society's willingness to witness its most violent manifestations. Lethal injection didn't eliminate death penalty debate. It simply moved the suffering out of sight. The condemned still died. Victims' families still grieved. Death row inmates still lived in isolation waiting. But witnesses no longer saw smoke rising from burning flesh. They no longer smelled electrocuted bodies. They could tell themselves that execution had become humane, because they couldn't see the evidence that contradicted that belief. Gruesome Gertie sits silent now in Angola's museum. Tourists photograph it. Students study it. Historians document it. The chair that killed 87 people has become an artifact, a reminder of methods deemed too brutal even for a system designed to kill. Andrew Lee Jones's name isn't widely remembered outside Louisiana. He was one execution among thousands in America's long history of capital punishment. But his death marked the last time Louisiana used its electric chair. 55 days made the difference between burning and chemicals. Both methods killed. One was retired because it revealed too clearly what the state was doing. The other continues because it hides the truth better. In the end, Gruesome Gertie's legacy isn't about whether capital punishment is right or wrong. It's about how societies choose which violence to witness, and which violence to look away from. The machine stopped. The questions
If you enjoy
remain.
real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content.